Welcome to this explainer. We're going to jump straight into one of the absolute wildest, true David versus Goliath stories to come out of the Second World War. I mean, just imagine this for a second. You're a 21-year-old sergeant, you're armed with a weapon your own army basically tells you is useless, and you are steering down a 56-ton armored monster right in the middle of a shattered German village. This isn't some Hollywood script, okay? This is the very real nightmare that George Burns faced on December 5th, 1944. Today, we're going to break down exactly how he managed to do the impossible, using nothing but a metal tube, the help of a complete stranger, and one fatal flaw in German engineering.
To really understand this moment, we have to drop right into the thick, choking smoke and absolute chaos of Lucherberg, Germany. It's 7 in the morning. Sergeant George Burns, who's with the 104th Infantry Division, is helplessly watching his platoon get methodically torn apart. His guys are pressed hard against these cracked concrete walls. They're bleeding, they're completely exhausted, and worst of all, they are totally out of anti-tank ammunition. Suddenly, out of the smoke, this stranger appears. It's a soldier Burns had literally never met before, and crazy enough, whose name he would never even learn. He steps up, takes one look at Burns, takes a look at the absolute suicide mission he's about to undertake, and utters these 7 incredible words: "If you've got guts enough, I'll load for you."
So, how did they even end up in this desperate situation? Well, the 104th Division, they were famously known as the Timberwolves, actually had this unique superpower. They were specially trained to fight in the pitch dark. Their commander, Major General Terry Allen, was a huge believer that darkness favored the attacker. It let them sneak into positions that would literally be a bloodbath during the daytime. And honestly, it worked brilliantly for capturing Lucherberg. But holding it? Yeah, that was a completely different story. Dawn broke, and with it came this massive German counterattack. The Timberwolves' greatest advantage, the darkness, was just gone. So now they're caught out in this deadly daytime street fight with a massive 56-ton Tiger tank firing an 88mm cannon from just 30 yards away, straight into Burns' position.
Section 1. A Doomed Doctrine. Why the Army said it was impossible. Okay, let's dive into this. You might be wondering, where on earth was the United States Army's heavy armor? Why was an infantry sergeant left completely alone to fight a Tiger tank, basically with his bare hands? Well, the tragic reality is that this was a massive, top-down institutional failure. Look at the doctrine we've got here. Back in 1941, the Army created this entirely new branch called the Tank Destroyer Force. Their motto? Seek, strike, and destroy. The idea was to build these really fast, lightly armored vehicles to rush forward and hunt German armor out in open terrain. But look at the reality column. The Germans just didn't fight in massive open waves anymore. They fought in super close terrain, buried in hedgerows, and in tight, winding village streets. Because of that, these open-topped American tank destroyers became incredibly vulnerable. So commanders just started using them as static guns. And tragically, on that morning of December 5th, there was an American tank destroyer sitting right there in the Lucherberg village square. But its crew had completely sealed the hatches, idled the engine, and absolutely refused to engage that Tiger.
So the crucial point is this agonizing millimeter-by-millimeter math. See, because the Army had built an entirely specialized branch just to kill tanks, they barely bothered to upgrade the regular infantry's weapons. The absolute only thing Burns could find was an old M1 bazooka strapped to the side of that cowardly tank destroyer. But guys, the M1 was just a 9-pound tube that had practically maxed out its potential years ago. Under totally perfect laboratory conditions, it could maybe, just maybe, penetrate 100 millimeters of steel. Meanwhile, a Tiger tank had 100 millimeters of flat, cemented steel on its front hull alone. Add in the freezing cold of December, using a rocket that had been violently bouncing around in the back of a supply truck for weeks, and the odds of actually penetrating that armor were essentially zero. The military manuals literally told infantrymen, don't even try.
And I really want to emphasize this staggering number right here, $36,000. That was the cost to the American taxpayer for a single purpose-built M10 tank destroyer. A massive, specialized machine that was sitting idle in the village square, its crew basically telling an infantry sergeant to go to hell while his men were actively dying.
Now, compare that to this, $20. That was the cost of a single bazooka rocket. Burns and his mysterious loader had exactly 9 or 10 of these $20 rockets between the two of them to do the job that the $36,000 machine completely refused to do.
Section 2. Desperate Arithmetic. 3 misses and a tactical shift. So, Burns and his loader grab the bazooka. They use the thick black smoke from a burning truck as cover, and they actually creep to within 50 feet of the Tiger. Burns fires. The rocket leaves this bright trail of white smoke and totally misses. The loader slides another round in. Burns fires again. Another miss.
Finally, he steps completely out of the doorway, we're talking zero cover here, aims right at the flat steel plate of the Tiger's hull, and fires at point-blank range. The shaped charge detonates right against the croup armor and leaves nothing but a scorch mark. No penetration whatsoever. 3 rounds fired, 0 effect. Every single manual was right. The Tiger then lurches into gear and grinds its way down a side street. Burns, defying all human logic, actually chases it. He rounds a corner and just stops dead in his tracks. The Tiger's massive 88mm cannon is pointed right at his chest. Worse, it is heavily surrounded by a screen of German infantrymen. Burns has maybe 2 seconds to make a decision here, and what he does next is an absolute masterpiece of cold, rapid calculus. He quickly realizes the armor is completely impenetrable, so he aims the bazooka away from the tank and fires it directly at the human being standing in front of it. A shaped charge designed to punch through steel is absolutely devastating against flesh at 30 feet. He steps out, fires, and steps back to reload. Over and over. He ends up killing 8 German soldiers, utterly breaking their confidence and effectively stripping the tank of its infantry protection.
Let's move to and see how this builds. By stripping away that infantry screen, he basically forces the German tank crew into a complete panic. They literally can't depress their main gun low enough to hit Burns standing in the doorway. So the driver throws this 56-ton monster into gear and lurches out of the side street onto the main road, rapidly pulling away from the square. And for the very first time in this grueling, terrifying 15-minute fight, George Burns is looking squarely at the back of the tank.
Section 3. The unarmored weakness. The Achilles heel of a monster.
You know, we often think of tanks as these invincible blocks of solid steel. But underneath it all, a tank is really just a machine, right? It's a vehicle with a breathing engine. And that mechanical reality creates a fatal, completely unarmored flaw. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the ventilation grill, highlighted here. A Tiger tank is powered by this massive 650 horsepower Maybach gasoline engine. It runs incredibly hot, and it needs enormous amounts of cooling air. That air enters through ventilation grills right on the rear deck. And get this, these aren't protected by 100 millimeters of cemented steel, they are just slatted openings covered by super thin sheet metal, leading directly down to the fuel lines and nearly 600 liters of highly flammable gasoline. The designers back in Kassel, Germany, never even bothered to armor it because they never ever imagined an infantryman would survive long enough to get close enough to shoot it. So Burns steps right into the middle of the street. The tank is accelerating away from him. He has maybe 2 rounds left in total. He raises the bazooka. He is exactly 20 feet away, so close he can literally feel the heat radiating off the engine deck, and he pulls the trigger. The rocket crosses the air in a fraction of a second and hits the ventilation grill dead center. Now, a bazooka works by focusing a superheated jet of copper. Against thick steel, it fails, but against thin sheet metal, it punches through like a fist through a screen door. Boom! It hits the fuel lines. The Tiger immediately catches fire from the inside, blooming this bright, terrifying orange. The tank waddles up the road, just burning, until the hatches finally blow open and the crew bails out onto the pavement. Burns drops his empty bazooka, raises his M1 rifle, and as his official Army citation brutally records in just 12 words, killed the crew with his rifle as they abandoned the burning tank.
Section 4. A second strike. The legacy of Lucherberg.
Burns had just done the literal impossible. But think about it. What does it mean when a lone soldier proves an entire military doctrine completely wrong? What does it say to the United States Army when a 21-year-old does in 15 minutes what billions of dollars of specialized equipment completely failed to do? And what makes this story even wilder is that Lucherberg was not a fluke. Look at this timeline. Burns is wounded shortly after. He recovers and he crosses the Rhine in March 1945. Then, on April 2nd, he faces another German tank. Only this time, there are no misses, no bouncing rockets. He knows exactly where to aim, how to close the distance, and exactly where steel gives way. He advances completely alone and knocks out the second tank with 3 perfectly placed rounds. He earns a Silver Star and a Battlefield Commission, going from sergeant to second lieutenant in the blink of an eye. And this brilliantly illustrates that the first kill was pure, desperate survival. But the second kill, that was absolute calculated mastery.
Burns' terrifying battlefield innovation was honestly the writing on the wall for the Army's multi-billion-dollar failure. After the war wrapped up, the European Theater Board took a really hard look at reality. They dissolved the separate tank destroyer force entirely. The whole doctrine of seek, strike, and destroy was just quietly buried. The Army finally woke up and realized that stripping their infantry of serious anti-tank weapons and forcing them to rely on specialists who might just lock their hatches and hide was a catastrophic mistake.
Burns survived the war and lived quietly down in Florida for 28 years until he passed away in 1994. But he never forgot that morning.
And you know, he never stopped asking one haunting question. Who was the unknown loader? Who is the man who stepped right out of the smoke, offered up his own life with the words, "If you've got guts enough, I'll load for you," stood just 20 feet from a Tiger tank, and then just vanished back into the war, never to be identified? It is such a profound reminder that behind every sterile military manual, behind every single multi-billion-dollar doctrine, history is ultimately forged by the quiet, unrecorded sacrifices of ordinary human beings. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll leave you to think about that phantom soldier who helped change history, only to disappear forever into the smoke.